Hi, a little quick context for today's class, or rather for tomorrow's class. Um, as we saw with the Pueblos in the Southwest, Native peoples increasingly found themselves unable to disconnect from the new world created by empire in the Americas. We found that the Spanish were so interconnected with Native peoples that the Native peoples who revolted eventually brought them back in order to reestablish relationships based on trade, a need for alliance with other Native peoples, and so forth. Well, east of the Mississippi River, Native peoples found themselves similarly positioned. That is, they were part of a global market economy. They were involved as such in relationships with the colonies that established at the seacoast by England and France. And as a result, they couldn't also disconnect from relationships with Europeans. On the other hand, it's also really important not to understand Native history exclusively from the perspective of the relationship between Indians and empire. Now, as I said, they can't really disconnect from this global market economy, but empire tends to overreach in terms of describing its ability to both colonize space, that is, to control it territorially, and also to control the relationships with Native people. So we want to think about this vast territory, most of which is actually demographically Indian and as accordingly politically Indian controlled space in terms of the political power and independence of Native peoples. Now, we'll start this week with a look at 1701, the great peace between the French and their allies in the Great Lakes, and the Iroquois and their allies in the English colonies, particularly Philadelphia or Pennsylvania colony and the colony of New York. Although the treaty itself was between the French, their allied Indians, and the Iroquois, it's not with the English as a colonial power. It is still significant in terms of colonial relationships. The hallmark of the contest between colonies in the Americas, between the French and the English, was competition over the fur trade, which from the mid 1600s to 1701 drove incredibly violent competition, drove people to essentially try to expand territory, control trade routes that links the interior and fur trade hunting territories with markets on the coast. The violent warfare we talked about um, provided a basis for some political cohesion between smaller village peoples that were connected to the empire and the larger confederacy of the Iroquois. Um, this great peace had a profound impact on populations, as we discussed. Increased violence led to increased slave raiding, adoptions, ritual adoptions, that sort of thing. The 1701 peace essentially was an agreement between the French and these two collections of allies that they would not go to war. And the French put themselves in between their allies in the Great Lakes and the Iroquois as mediators. And after 1701, until the French were expelled from North America following the Seven Years' War, they spent most of their political capital trying to maintain that peace. And so, really fixated on that border between the Great Lakes, here say at Fort Niagara, and the Appalachians, that territory that connected the Great Lakes and the trade that moved east from that Great Lakes into the colonial space that was dominated by the Iroquois Confederacy. Now, there are different interpretations about the Peace of 1701 when France agreed on a permanent peace with the Iroquois and also to maintain that peace between their allies and the Iroquois. Some people have interpreted this as a victory for the Iroquois. Some people have interpreted it as a victory for the French. I would offer another interpretation, which is that it marked a change in the relationship politically between French allied Indians and Iroquois that resulted in the diminution of the French Indian alliance and the emergence instead of alternate independent Indian confederacies, allies, and social formations in the interior who were increasingly divorced from the politics of empire and operating independently on their own behalf. Um, this result in changes is not exclusive to the Northeast, however. There are other things going on. The French Allied focus on this borderland area between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Great Lakes led to shifts in population. People who have been clustered in the western part of the Great Lakes, on the western shores of Lake Superior, and the western shores of Lake Michigan, began to move back into that space that had been a no man's land between Iroquois in upstate New York and Ontario and Michigan. And so you had people repopulating the Ohio Valley, this region here, which had been sort of emptied out during the 50 years preceding because of constant raiding back and forth. So you had lots of people who were moving into this space who had been allies of the French and refugees from the region from, say, what would now be Detroit through the Ohio River country who'd moved west. But there were another series of people moving back who'd been expelled earlier. The Shawnee, who also emerged from the Ohio River country in the early 1600s and fleeing the Iroquois raids, moved south. They moved through Pennsylvania, down through territory that became Georgia and the Carolinas, as far south as Florida. And they are also following on the heels of people who are identified in records as the Westos, but who are really a conglomeration of Iroquois-speaking peoples also fleeing the Iroquois. Both the Shawnee and the Westos get caught up in coastal settlement trades with the English that are focused on slave trading. The Carolinas are formed more or less as sort of colonies that were created to sort of provide food sources for sugar colonies in the Caribbean. They're set up as slaving colonies that are mass producing crops, rice crops in particular, in this early stage to feed, as I said, sugar colonies. And the raiding that it happens includes raiding for slaves, as the peoples in the coastal area, smaller tribal people, are essentially sold into slavery by the incoming Shawnee, and in particular the Westos. The Shawnee then begin to collaborate with English colonies in the Carolinas. They also act as go-betweens between the larger tribes in the interior, the Cherokee, the Creek, the Chickasaw, and the Choctaw. They then, after 1701, begin to move back into the Ohio River Valley and the Shenandoah River valleys, the place that they had originally come from. So this long period between the mid-1600s and the early 1700s see them moving throughout the coast, establishing political and economic relationships with a large variety of Indian peoples, as well as a lot of different English colonial settlements. And as they move back to the Ohio country, where they converge with people who are moving from the western Great Lakes into the Ohio country, you have a very dynamic political space because you have the arrival of Shawnees with some original claim to homeland in the Ohio country, as well as people like the Fox, the Menominee, the Miami, who also had some claim to the same region, but then also outsiders, some Ojibwe, some Ottawa, some Potawatomi, Illinois peoples who are coming from territory farther west back into the east. All of these people are exercising a tremendous degree of independence from French Empire, and while they're cooperating to some extent with English Empire, they're really cooperating on a more individual level with English traders who establish villages in the Ohio country that are set up to profit from this trade. Logstown is a really important village that's set up. It's the link between the Ohio country and the Allegheny country. It's a site where there are lots of these different Indian peoples converging. Um, in addition to the peoples that I mentioned, there are in the space a group of people who are increasingly calling themselves the Mingos. They are actually Seneca people. That's the western door of the Iroquois Confederacy. But after 1701, the Seneca, who are a very large nation within the Iroquois Five Nations, begin to operate more independently. Large numbers of the Seneca who've been adopted, as we've mentioned before, many of with ties to the southeast, so Catawba Indians, who are also a people from the southeast, um, many of whom have been adopted into the Confederacy, begin to sort of operate more independently. That is, they operate outside the political boundaries of the Iroquois Confederacy. They begin to identify themselves as Mingos, and they begin to try to assert an allegiance from the sort of centralized planning that the Confederacy tries to conduct from Onondaga in the middle of upstate New York. This increasing emergence of an independent body of loosely affiliated people with the Iroquois, Shawnee, who, as they make their way back up north, also find themselves in alliance and return to this territory with the Delaware, who are people who are moving east or west from their eastern territory in the Susquehanna Valley and Pennsylvania shoreline in New York area. All these people converge, and there's a degree of political independence that follows because none of them are entirely attached to empire. And this is the sort of stew or the melting pot that exists at the outset of the Seven Years' War. That is, a large number of native peoples, many of whom have had histories of displacement, many of whom are reimagining themselves as nations during their move back to the Ohio country, and have only the loosest of ties with either Great Britain and their colonies or New France. Although both Great Britain and France will have political claims that they want to make on these people, and those claims will be called in during the Seven Years' War. In the middle of all this, you have a convergence of people, political leaders, with a history of working with the colonies as allies. These are people that you could think of as leaders in Richard White's middle ground, people who have learned to accommodate empire in order to get things for their people, in order to engage in trade relationships, in order to form military alliances. But you have an emerging group in this sort of milieu of people who, particularly among the refugees who are returning back, are identified in records as nativists, that is, as people who want to reject all form of relationship with empire and begin to assert not only Indian independence, but to reimagine themselves in ways that really resemble the sort of racialism we've talked about before. That is, thinking of themselves as Indian people, as a distinct race, and as separate from either the English or the French. These nativists are going to be centered around people like Pontiac, who leads an uprising following the Seven Years' War, and then later people like the Shawnee leader Tecumseh. This nativist movement is increasingly calling for independence from colonies, and they also are increasingly reacting to the growing presence of English settlers. As the colonies become filled in on the coast, people begin moving across the Alleghenies into the Ohio country to settle. Now, there is a history of British Empire trying to block this settlement, but they're really not able to control their own settlers any more than they are able to control native peoples in the interior region. So you have a very volatile mix of native peoples who are recent immigrants, native peoples with long-time claims, and European settlers who have moved west looking for opportunity, all of whom are really operating outside of the control of empire. And that's the sort of powder keg which will be in place at the outset of the Seven Years' War. We'll talk about these materials in relation to the readings in class. Thanks.